So I guess we can start. So welcome everyone. Welcome to this book launch, which is devoted to Karen Eng's recent book titled Hegel's Concept of Life, Self-Consciousness, Freedom, Logic. And before introducing the speakers, I'd like to mention some practical matters. So please remain muted as long as you're not asking a question. And if you have a question, please press the icon with the blue hand. Yes, I think that's the best way to proceed, especially with a large audience like today. And you can find this icon at the bottom of the participants column. And please do so after the Q&A has started. Then I would like to ask you to switch on your video, unless you have Wi-Fi problems, because we feel that it's nice to see faces and to imitate as much as we can an on-campus situation. But of course, if you have Wi-Fi problems, feel free to switch off your camera and also to put your question in the chat if you have a question. Then I'd like to ask you to keep your questions short and focused so that many of us have the opportunity to ask a question or contribute to the discussion. And then I'd like to mention that there is a discount flyer for Karen's book on the program on our website. And then I also wanted to mention that we have this habit of leaving open the Zoom meeting after the formal part of the session. So everyone who wishes to do so can stay on and participate in more informal conversations. So I now turn to the next item. So I would like to welcome and introduce the author of this wonderful book, Hegel's Concept of Life. So congratulations, first of all, on the publication, Karen. Karen Eng is assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and her areas of research range from Hegel and German idealism more generally to critical theory. And in her work, she often tries to make these classical texts by Hegel and others relevant to contemporary debates in social and political philosophy. And I think that this is a very worthwhile way of doing philosophy. So Karen will present her book in about 10 to 15 minutes. And this will be followed by 3 responses by Manja Kisner, Anton Cabbishkin, and Benjamin Berger. And after that, after each response, Karen will respond in turn. And after that, we will have like 20 or 30 minutes for a general discussion. So I give the floor to Karen. You're muted, Karen.
Still muted?
Yeah.
I think I clicked it twice after a whole semester, still messing up on Zoom. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you so much for organizing this panel. And thank you so much to Benjamin, to Anton, and to Manja for taking the time to respond to my book. I know how much time and work these things take, so I really do mean it, especially this crazy semester that we're all going through. I really, really appreciate it. So I do want to keep my remarks short here. I'm going to start by saying just a couple of sort of high-level general things in terms of the motivation of the book. And then I don't want to, I'm not expecting that everybody's read the whole thing. I'm going to do a quick overview, basically just of the trajectory of the argument, going through sort of some of the key claims that I make in the chapters. But in terms of my motivation for this book, I was, the entire book was sort of set off by this thought that I didn't think that we had given an adequate account of this very puzzling thing, namely that Hegel concludes his science of logic, and actually sort of this very important concluding argument on the idea and ultimately the absolute idea begins with this discussion of life. And I think recently a lot of this has sort of changed. I think since I began working on this, that I think now a lot of people are very interested in thinking about this puzzle. But when I started working on this project, and it was going through, it was my first time reading the science of logic in graduate school. When I arrived at this moment, it was just this very big puzzle. Why on earth does Hegel sort of conclude this monumental text with a discussion on life? So everything sort of, if you want to think about the teleology of the book and the interpretation that I offer, it's sort of all aimed at trying to understand this chapter in the science of logic, where Hegel claims that life is the immediate idea. The second sort of motivating move that encouraged me to begin this project was a sort of broader philosophical conviction that that the activity and processes of life and mind are continuous, that in order to understand the activity and operation of cognitive processes, of cognition, we really need to understand something about the activity and processes of life. I think thinking about this continuity and reciprocity in many ways is now somewhat commonplace in the philosophy of mind. In the history of philosophy, usually Aristotle is cited as the person who sort of first started thinking about this. But I think that in modern philosophy, and I'm using that term very broadly, from the early moderns to the late moderns. But I think in modern philosophy, it is Hegel and the German idealists who think the most deeply about this connection between life and mind. And I felt that this aspect of Hegel and the German idealists was somewhat underappreciated. Sometimes it was ignored. And in other places, I think it was misunderstood. So I thought that thinking about life in cognitive and logical terms would help to sort of rethink Hegel's rationalism. That pretty much since Schelling's criticism, sort of beginning in the 1830s, of Hegel's logic, of Hegel's concept of the concept, I think that ever since that very early criticism launched by Schelling, that Hegel's rationalism and Hegel's logic has sort of been treated badly, I guess you could say, and that thinking about this question of life and thinking about life in logical terms in particular would maybe help to overturn that sort of very long-standing interpretive history. So maybe I'll just very quickly try to go over some of the central claims of the book. The book is divided into two parts. In the first part of the book, I try to introduce what I call the propositiveness theme. And I basically try to develop, in trying to think about the significance of life in Hegel's philosophy, I start by turning to Kant's third critique, that I really think that in the context of German idealism, the way to think about the role of life in cognition is by beginning with Kant's third critique, where Kant, in the third critique, argues that our capacity, our power of judgment presupposes something that he calls the principle of propositiveness. I begin, so of course, in the Kant literature, it's very complicated in terms of how to interpret this, but I try to focus in on what's important for Hegel. And ultimately, I argue that the sense of propositiveness that is most relevant in Hegel's sort of appropriation of this Kantian idea is this notion of internal propositiveness that Kant introduces in the critique of teleological judgment. And one of the passages that that sort of frames my discussion, I pull this from the teleology chapter in Hegel's logic, where Hegel essentially says that this notion, this idea of internal propositiveness that we see in the third critique, he says that it's one of Kant's greatest services to philosophy. He says that with the concept of internal propositiveness, what this actually opens up is the concept of life and the idea. And the claim that I try to investigate throughout is Hegel's suggestion that actually this idea of internal propositiveness, Hegel says that it does something, it does positively for philosophy what the Critique of Reason did negatively. So I interpret this as Hegel trying to suggest that internal propositiveness has a positive role to play in Kant's critical philosophy. And in the second chapter of the book, the first chapter is the introduction, the second chapter of the book, I try to think about this passage and think about exactly what the role of internal propositiveness is when we try to think about the capacity of judgment. I basically conclude that Hegel thinks that in Hegel's reading of Kant, there is a way in which the concept of internal purposiveness and judgment, that there is a reciprocity between these two ideas, and that this basically sets the stage for the way that Hegel comes to think of the relationship between self-consciousness and life as he develops his own philosophy. In the third chapter, I sort of chart Hegel's development from his early text, the Differenzschrift, up to the Phenomenology. And this is, again, all of this is to try to set the stage to get us ready for the interpretation of the logic. I argue that basically already in this early text in Hegel's Differenzschrift, where Hegel uses the Schellingian language of the absolute as the identity between the subjective subject-object and the objective subject-object, that basically this is Hegel's way of trying to appropriate the propositiveness theme. That in thinking about this relationship, and of course this language of the objective subject-object is Hegel's language, Hegel's Schellingian language for life. And so in the Differenzschrift, I basically argue that Hegel is already developing an account of his philosophical method as the relationship between life and self-consciousness. I think that the Differenzschrift is really important for the way that Hegel subsequently develops his philosophy. I also take up Hegel's critique of Ficta. I think Hegel's critique of Ficta is usually the focus is on the ought critique, Hegel's critique of Ficta's account of infinite striving. Instead, I focus on the way in which Hegel's critique is really focused in on the propositiveness issue, that actually part of Hegel's critique that sometimes goes underappreciated is that he criticizes Ficta for not having an adequate account of nature or an adequate account of the not I in order to complement his account of the self-positing I. So from there, I moved to try to develop a new interpretation of this very famous chapter 4 of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, where Hegel develops the account of self-consciousness in connection with life. And I try to argue there that Hegel gives us, from a variety of perspectives, an argument that life is constitutive of self-consciousness, and that this continues the debate because, of course, one of the major disagreements between Kant and Hegel is precisely on the regulative versus the constitutive status of this concept of life, or the concept of internal purposiveness. The second half of the book, then, sort of having set up set the stage for this in a discussion of Kant and Hegel's earlier works, the second half of the book tries to give an interpretation of the science of logic that is, again, oriented around the aim of getting to the conclusion in the idea where Hegel claims that life is the immediate idea. My strategy in the second part of the book is to try to interpret Hegel's subjective logic along the lines of Hegel's version of a critique of judgment, that we can read the progression of the chapters of the subjective logic as ultimately leading to the idea that just as Kant claimed that judgment presupposes something like a principle of propositiveness, Hegel's claim in the conclusion of the logic is that our thinking about cognition needs to presuppose something about the concept of life. And I begin in chapter 4, and I actually, this is where, just thinking about how I started working on this. Chapter 4 is about the concluding section of the doctrine of essence on actuality, and in many ways, it's the thing that I started working on first when I first started working on Hegel, and it remains the most puzzling and difficult part for me after working on it all this time. I still have to say I don't know that I've fully worked out the concept of actuality in Hegel, so I'm happy to hear questions or hear other accounts of this in the Q&A, because I really do find that after all is said and done, I think something about the account of actuality is still the most puzzling for me in Hegel. But what I try to give an account of there is what Hegel calls the immanent deduction, or the genesis of the concept. I really like this language of the genesis of the concept, obviously given the focus on the concept of life. That Hegel thinks about the concept in terms of its genesis, I think is very significant. In chapter 4, I try to argue that the genesis of the concept for Hegel is essentially essentially he's going to try to offer an account of activity, and more specifically of activity as purposive, and that this is what allows him to sort of give his immanent deduction of the idea of the concept, such that Hegel's concept of the concept is essentially modeled on or built up from the concept of internal purposiveness. Chapters 5 to 8 basically form a continuous argument and take up sort of the sections in the subjective logic on subjectivity, objectivity, and then to the idea. In chapter 5, I argue, sort of taking up this idea that the subjective logic should be read as Hegel's critique of judgment. I argue that appropriating this Hölderlinian idea that judgment should be understood as original division. And this is something that is also quite consistent in Hegel's works from his early work. So in Faith and Knowledge, the idea of judgment as original division is very important. This is sustained throughout the account in the logic. I argue that in appropriating and sort of transforming this Hölderlinian idea of judgment as original division, that Hegel, unlike Hölderlin, so Hölderlin is going to argue that the original division of judgment is grounded in an original unity of being. Hegel argues instead, and he sort of introduces this new formulation that is very important for my interpretation, that judgment as original division is grounded in what he calls the original division of life. And this turn of phrase is a very important part of my interpretation of the subjective logic in the remainder of the book. Another argument that I tried to make in chapter 5, connecting with the proposiveness theme, is that the way that Hegel thinks about what he calls judgments of the concept in the subjective logic, the way that he thinks about what he calls the highest form of judgment is actually modeled on the way that Kant thinks about teleological judgments, in that the idea of this idea of Gattung concepts or the idea of a genus serves the function of being a ground of predication. And in the transition to the chapter on objectivity, which I take up in chapter 6, I argue that the genus or this idea of the Gattung provides not just the ground of predication in Hegel, but also provides the ground for thinking about objective existence or the objective realization of objects. In chapter 7, I sort of arrive at the chapter 7 takes up the idea where Hegel argues that life is the immediate shape of the idea. My central claim there, I go through the chapter on life in detail, but my central claim there is that in arguing that life is the immediate idea, what that ultimately means for Hegel is that life opens up the possibility of intelligibility as such. That the function that life serves in a logical context is to open up the very possibility of rendering things intelligible, so that the question of intelligibility for Hegel is fundamentally bound up with the way that living things that the activity and processes of living things is basically the most immediate shape of what rendering intelligible looks like. And so chapter 7 goes through the chapter on life, and what I argue is that Hegel presents 3 a priori form constraints. I call them form constraints, but essentially that there's 3 moments in the chapter on life, namely corporeality, this idea of externality, and the process of the genus, that these 3 form constraints essentially open up or enable cognition by setting certain constraints or limits on the way that cognition or self-conscious cognition can be realized. And finally, in the final and concluding chapter, I argue that what Hegel calls absolute method should be understood as the dialectic between life and cognition, and that this is sort of my reading of the absolute idea that concludes the science of logic. I argue that this is essentially this should be viewed as we should think about this in terms of the foundation of Hegel's entire philosophical system. That instead of thinking about the absolute idea in, say, Neoplatonic terms, that this ongoing and reciprocal relationship relationship between life and cognition is what allows Hegel to think about how things are rendered intelligible from a variety of perspectives as we move on to the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of spirit. So maybe I'll stop there. I'm really looking forward to hearing the comments and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first respondent, Manja Kisner. She currently teaches at the University of Wuppertal, and she works on Kant, Schopenhauer, and German idealism. She's the author of many articles and book chapters, and I'd like to mention her monograph, which is titled Der Wille und das Ding an sich, Schopenhauers Willensmetaphysik in ihrem Bezug zu Kants kritischer Philosophie und dem nachkantischen Idealismus. And this was published in 2016. So Manja, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here. So I'm very pleased that I can be a part of this book launch today. Actually, I started to be interested in Karen Eng's book already before it was published, when I came across the book announcement and I saw that the topic will be on Hegel and the concept of internal purposiveness. And at that time, I was trying to work out my own project on drives in Kant, Ficta, and Schelling. And my idea was that the concept of internal purposiveness is somehow crucial for understanding the notion of drives in their systems. And then when I saw that Karen's book will be on Hegel and the concept of life and internal purposiveness, I was, of course, immediately excited about the book, and I was looking forward to read it. So I was from the beginning somehow in favor of Karen's interpretation, but I also learned a lot from this great book. So my commentary today will discuss Karen's interpretation from this perspective, focusing on Kant's and Hegel's notion of internal purposiveness. So Karen's book presents a very detailed and original interpretation of Hegel's philosophy, which is carried out very meticulously and convincingly. And in her book, she reinterprets Hegel's philosophy by pointing out the systematic role of the concept of life throughout his works, and by stressing also the importance of this concept for his philosophical system at large. In doing so, she argues that the concept of life is constitutive for describing Hegel's dynamic account of reason, and for explaining also Hegel's views on the process and activities of absolute knowing. And then Karen substantiates her main claim about the key role of the concept of life in Hegel's work by showing how this concept is crucial for Hegel's account of self-consciousness, as well as for freedom and logic. And for these purposes, she focuses on Hegel's Differenzschrift, phenomenology of spirit, and then most extensively on the science of logic. And in order to provide this systematic account of the concept of life and demonstrate why this concept has a distinctly philosophical meaning and even logical meaning within Hegel's system, she sets up and defends three interrelated claims that I would just like to recap very briefly here. So according to Karen's first claim, Hegel's views on the concept of life are closely connected with his notion of purposiveness, we already heard. So her second claim concerns Hegel's speculative identity thesis and argues for a necessary relation between life and self-consciousness. And then her third claim focuses on Hegel's account of judgment and argues for that Hegel's original judgment of life provides the basis for his theory of judgment developed in the science of knowledge. And now in my comment, I would like to focus on Karen's first claim concerning the purposiveness theme. It is through this topic that Karen then discusses also Hegel's philosophical relation to his contemporaries, so in particular to Fichte, Hölderlin, and Schelling. And Kant's third critique, of course, plays a special role here. So Karen claims that the core tenets of Hegel's philosophy center on the purposiveness themes. And then more specifically, she emphasizes the importance of Kant's notion of internal purposiveness for Hegel. And she claims that the notion of internal purposiveness serves as a model for Hegel's account of the concept and also for understanding reason as purposive activity. And she speaks, for instance, about Hegel's unequivocal endorsement of Kant's conception of internal purposiveness, and refers to Hegel's declaration that Kant's account of internal purposiveness was his great service to philosophy. And as I have mentioned, I'm very excited about this strategy of focusing on the notion of internal purposiveness and interpreting Hegel in Hegel's philosophy in this light. But I also think that the meaning of this notion still remains a bit ambiguous in Kant as well as in Hegel, although of course Hegel pushes this topic further and discusses it more in detail and maybe more explicitly also than Kant. And here I would like to address some of the issues that I'm still a bit intrigued by. So my first question would be that I would like to raise is if it is really specifically Kant's internal purposiveness that is relevant to Hegel, or could it also be purposiveness more generally, or maybe even Kant's notion of practical purposiveness that Hegel would use as a model? So let me explain a bit my thoughts here. So the concept of internal purposiveness is certainly not one of the main concepts of Kant's critical philosophy, and it has also a very specific function within the teleological part of the third critique. And of course, it functions only as a heuristic regulative principle in Kant. And then moreover, Kant also seems to introduce this peculiar principle of internal purposiveness in analogy with our practical purposiveness. For instance, he claims that he tries to explain natural ends with the help of a, I quote, remote analogy with our own causality in accordance with ends. So in Kant, I think we find different kinds of purposiveness. Practical purposiveness Kant defines as a purposive causality, or causality according to final ends, nexus finalis, and this causality is a conceptual causality. And then technical causality is, of course, only external causality, but practical purposiveness related to pure practical reason and the autonomy of the will could also be conceived maybe as bringing about some kind of internal purposiveness. So I would like to ask Karen, is what role would she ascribe to Kant's notion really of practical purposiveness maybe in this context? And then I think that the situation gets even a bit more complicated if we take into account other notions of purposiveness that we can find in Kant. So for instance, in the introduction to the third critique, Kant refers to the notion of purposiveness of nature and defines it as a, I quote, special a priori concept that has its origin strictly in the reflecting power of judgment. So he uses this term purposiveness of nature there in order to describe the unity of empirical laws. But then this notion is not, I think, the same as the principle of internal purposiveness in the second part of the third critique. So I would like to hear a bit more about Karen's views on these different kinds of purposiveness. Maybe she could tell us something more about how she distinguishes between them and why she thinks that it is internal purposiveness that Hegel uses as a model. Then the aim of Karen's interpretation is also to argue that Hegel transforms, of course, this Kantian merely regulative concept of internal purposiveness into a positive and constitutive concept that provides foundations then for Hegel's philosophy of a concept and for his account of reason as purposive activity. Karen quotes Hegel's statements such as purpose, Zweck, is the concept itself in its concrete existence, and reason is purposive activity, zweckmäßiges Tun. But my question here is if Hegel really needs internal purposiveness specifically for these definitions, or could maybe some notion of practical purposiveness or maybe some other purposiveness more generally also suffice? But as I said, I'm actually very in favor of emphasizing this specifically internal purposiveness, but I'm just wondering what is new on the concept of internal purposiveness and how we could describe it. So is it maybe the dynamic, active aspect of internal purposiveness that makes this conception so relevant to Kant and also then attractive to Hegel? So for instance, when Kant speaks about purposive relations or purposive unity, these relations, this is also the case in the purposiveness of nature as unity of empirical laws, these unities, these purposive relations could still be conceived, I think, in a very static way. And also Kant's forma finalis as purposive form could maybe be taken also as something static. But then when Kant speaks about internal purposiveness, he relates it to formative powers, to drives, and really emphasizes this active dynamic dimension. And the same holds also for Hegel, for instance, for his account of reason as living activity in constant development, for instance, which again, I think emphasizes this dynamic aspect of purposiveness. And then when Hegel speaks about a dynamic purpose of form, an activity of form, or a self-organizing, self-producing form, he again mentions this active aspect. So something that tries to describe maybe the whole process and the development of Geist and not only the acts of determination. So the specific characteristic of internal purposiveness seems to be related somehow maybe with this dynamic active aspect of purposiveness. And this activity, of course, Karen also emphasizes, but what still remains intriguing to me is how do they then transform Kant as well as Hegel, a more static maybe views on purposive relations into this dynamic purposiveness, which then they call maybe internal purposiveness. It is just by using empirical examples about life, organisms, or is it possible somehow to explain this transformation also in a more conceptual way? And then I have a last question, which is also a bit related to this topic. So as Karen convincingly shows, besides Kant and Schelling, also Fichte, of course, influenced Hegel's account, but she also points out Hegel's critique of Fichte. So Hegel criticizes Fichte's notion of striving, which also points out the dynamics of reason. But at the same time, Fichte's striving describes some never-ending process as an infinite striving towards a synthesis, but without some final actualization. To me, however, it seems that Fichte's striving describes maybe even more closely Kant's principle of internal purposiveness than Hegel's notion. So Kant, for instance, takes organisms, organic nature, as an example for this internal purposiveness. And organic nature seems to describe exactly this never-ending striving, without some final actualization. So the activity of form in this sense seems to describe something that is maybe open and could in this way be illustrated as striving, but without maybe the possibility of achieving some final goal. So also here I'm wondering if Hegel is, with his understanding of purposiveness, for which actualization is crucial, not maybe making a step back towards a more traditional notion of purposiveness, maybe near the conceptual causality that Kant uses when he speaks about pure practical reason, and maybe using this as a notion, as a model. Or maybe could we say that Hegel brings together the aspects of internal elements and aspects of internal purposiveness and practical purposiveness? Hegel's views on the development of Geist, formation of Geist as a formation of practical reason might point in this direction. Yeah, so these are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. You raised so many interesting points. I'm going to try my best to address them. So your point about the different senses of proposiveness, I think, is really important. There's a sense, so maybe the first thing I'll say is that, of course, I want to separate out, what would be a responsible way to interpret Kant on these questions versus how Hegel sort of maybe more freely decides to appropriate these concepts in his own philosophy that doesn't sort of follow Kant as strictly as we might want him to if we're just thinking about an interpretation of Kant. So in terms of why internal purposiveness, in the book I do try to say that that there are, it could be that there are more, but there are at least 3 relevant senses of purposiveness when reading the third critique. The first, as you said, has to do with this idea of the purposiveness of nature, which is what Kant reflects upon in the introductions when he's thinking about what it is that judgment needs to presuppose in order to do its work, particularly of reflective judgment, to ascend from particulars to universals. In the critique of aesthetic judgment, there's a different sense of purposiveness, which refers to the subject's purposiveness, and I largely sort of put that aside. I don't really talk about that in the book. And then you're right, it's only in the critique of teleological judgment that this very specific sense of internal purposiveness, which he associates with the idea of a natural purpose or a natural end, is introduced. So how do I get to, why do I then say that, okay, it's that sense of purposiveness as internal is primary? The way that I try to get there is by arguing that Kant himself, so in terms of interpreting the purposiveness of nature, the sort of big puzzle that I think that this does span the third critique is how do we think about the purposiveness of nature? And for a large part of the text, Kant basically entertains the idea that, well, the only way to think about the purposiveness of nature is on a model of a designer artifact model, as I call it. That basically, how is it that we can think of nature as a whole to be purposive in this way? Well, we need to think about basically an architect or a designer that made it purposive in this way. This is sort of generally how we think about the idea of a purpose. And then there's a crucial passage where in the Critique of Teleological Judgment, where he argues that actually thinking about the purposiveness of nature in this way is actually a contradiction. So I try to, I make a big deal of this claim. And so I suggest that what Hegel must be doing in his reading of Kant in making internal purposiveness so central is that he basically agrees that there's something about thinking, if we want to think about the purposiveness of nature, and this requires us to bring in something like a designer or architect of nature, that this is actually to undermine the very idea of thinking about nature. And so this is why I try to argue that Hegel actually wants to say that, okay, then it must be the only consistent way to think about the purposiveness of nature is to think about it in the sense of internal rather than external purposiveness. And I think both Hegel and Schelling, there are some really nice passages where they are very, very dismissive of trying to introduce this idea of a godlike architect or designer. That if purposiveness requires us to introduce something like Hegel calls it, an extra mundane intelligence. Schelling also basically argues that introducing an idea of an architect of nature basically undermines the very idea of trying to think about nature. And so this is how I get to the idea that internal purposiveness must be primary. In terms of the why not the analogy claim that you bring up, this is also very puzzling, and I say a bit about this in the book, but since writing the book, I've just become more puzzled by it. Namely, that when Kant makes the analogy claim, what is so strange about it is that what he means by life and what he means by internal purposiveness are not the same. So Hegel makes the leap from, right? So clearly in that passage that I quote constantly about Kant, one of Kant's greatest services to philosophy, Hegel is basically saying, no, internal purposiveness, this is the concept of life. That's not the case for Kant. And so that's another really puzzling part of Kant's Critique of Teleological Judgment. That what's more puzzling is that, the example that he uses in the account of a natural purpose is, of course, he's thinking about a tree. The way that he talks about life, as especially so in the second critique, when he talks about life as a capacity of desire to act according to representations, that would imply that plants are not alive. So I just think that in terms of Kant interpretation, this question is very complicated, but it's very clear to me that Hegel makes that leap. He just says, you know what, this is weird. It's weird that Kant doesn't think that he's talking about life when he's talking about internal purposiveness. So I'm just going to say internal purposiveness opens up the concept of life. And that seems to be how he reads Kant on this issue. Sorry, I know in terms of practical, maybe, so you said so many interesting things about Ficta and about practical purposiveness. And maybe I'll just agree with you on the issue of what makes internal purposiveness so distinctive is the connection. I think you mentioned the connection to the dynamic notion of activity. I think that's absolutely right. I think the concept of activity is so important in Ficta, but very often it can almost seem like a black box. So he just keeps saying, right, activity, the I is active, it's active. Activity has to be contrasted with being, which is static. Activity is dynamic. And I think what the idea of internal purposiveness allows us to do is to try to unpack that notion of activity, to give it a bit more content, instead of just constantly going back to, well, the I is active. Internal purposiveness as sort of a kind of self-organization. I think it also helps us unpack a little bit this idea of spontaneity that is so important in Kant when thinking about the idea of self-consciousness. So I think there I'll just agree with you. With respect to striving, let's just say one really quick thing, also mostly in agreement, that I think that the notion of striving is connected to internal purposiveness. I think the way that Hegel tries to appropriate that is to think about, not to think about, of course, he's going to be opposed to notions of infinite striving, where we can never, infinite striving towards something we can never fully attain. But the way that he talks about self-consciousness as desire, I think, you're interested in the concept of drive, in the concept of tree. I think that the way that he thinks about self-consciousness as desire is maybe one way of trying to transform that notion of striving that's so important in Ficta. But an important difference, I guess, between desire and striving for Hegel, it's not infinite because desires can be satisfied. And I think that's very important because, of course, Hegel's always going to be opposed to notions of infinite striving towards something that we can never attain. So thank you so much for all of that.
Okay, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Manja, for your contribution so far. So I now turn to Anton Cabbishkin, who teaches at the University of Potsdam. He completed his PhD in 2019 at Johns Hopkins University, and he has published various articles on Schelling's and Hegel's philosophy of nature. So his work is also very much related to the topic of this book. Please, Anton.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm really happy to be able to discuss Karen's book with her and other participants here. And the book provides a really philosophically interesting and scholarly rigorous interpretation of large key parts of Hegel's logic. And it certainly takes time to engage with such an interpretation properly. And although I have already learned a great deal from the book, I still have to think through many aspects of this interpretation and read the book more carefully. So I'll present a couple of worries that I had while during the initial engagement with this book, and I hope that I will learn even more from discussing these worries now. So my first worry concerns Karen's discussion of Kant's account of purposiveness and of Kant's resolution of the antinomy of the teleological power of judgment. And here the exchange between Manja and Karen actually set this up really nicely, I think. So Karen argues that Kant's own preference for the model of external purposiveness in dealing with natural purposes fails on his own terms, and thus she sets the stage for Hegel's own acceptance of the internal purposiveness as sort of constitutive and not really regulative in any way. In arguing for this, she refers to Kant's own characterization of judgments of external purposiveness about nature as reckless and arbitrary. That was one point. And the second his characterization of thinking about natural purposes on the model of external purposiveness as contradictory, because they are natural and so aren't supposed to be artifacts and so aren't supposed to be purposive on the model of design, right? So my pushback on this is that in making the first point, Kant is simply saying that from the fact that some object in nature is beneficial for something else, we should not yet conclude that the idea of this benefit was in fact productive with respect to that object. But this does not have any immediate import for our thinking about natural organisms on this sort of design model, because about natural organisms, we are forced to think of them as purposive on different grounds. Namely, because they exhibit certain properties which we cannot make sense of without thinking about them on analogy with our own purposive activity, right? So properties such as the mutual dependence of their parts, the growth and assimilation of matter from the outside, and the propagation, right? On the other hand, the point about contradiction, so that think of natural purposes on this model of design is contradictory. Well, it's certainly relevant, but it's preliminary. So it's made by Kant in a sort of preliminary way, and then it's addressed in his discussion of the antinomy and the dialectic of the teleological power of judgment. And his point in the dialectic, as I read it, is that only we and creatures such as us who have to think of organisms on the model of external purposiveness, right? But the intuitive understanding that he introduces as a sort of Grenzbegriff, the limiting concept in order to bring out the peculiarities of our own cognitive powers, would be able to think of them without such a model. Because that intuitive understanding, as Karen herself puts it, for that intuitive understanding, the unity and form of a natural purpose displays this power of causality without invoking design. The whole, a synthetic universal, the unity and form of a single organism, the unity and form of a species or genus, comes concept, and the reciprocal dependence of whole and part allows us to conceive of a necessary lawful relation between concept and object that meets the requirement for purposive form. So that's in her on pages 55, 56 of her book. However, this is something that only an intuitive understanding can experience. For Kant, we are unable to explain anything on the basis of a synthetic universal due to the inherent limitations of our cognitive powers. And if this is correct, then Karen's contention that Kant's considerations about intuitive understanding are not important for his successors seems to be problematic, right? Because if Hegel claims that purposiveness without design is a constitutive category, right, then he does seem to ascribe to us some power, at least some powers of Kant's intuitive understanding. Okay, so this was my first worry. My second worry is completely unrelated. It has to do with just the methodology of reading and interpreting Hegel's logic. Right? And I'll focus on those chapters which precede Karen's discussion of the idea of life itself. And really the chapters 4 and 5 as sort of illustrating my worry. But first I want to say just something about maybe two different ways of looking at the progression of categories in Hegel's logic. So one we can call the forward-looking, another the backward-looking way of interpreting the progression of the categories in the logic. So in the most general terms, on the forward-looking approach, each move, right, each transition from one category to another should be understood on the basis of consideration of the categories arrived at previously, without reference to anything extrinsic or to what will come only later in the work. On the backward-looking interpretation or way of reading the logic, the progression can be explained by reference to something that only comes later, right? And Hegel, in several passages, seems to accept something like, or seems to endorse the forward-looking interpretation that. For example, in the preface to the second edition of the Greater Logic, and in the introduction to that to the Greater Logic as well. So I'll just quote a passage from the preface to the second edition of the Logic, which I think formulates this really nicely. So there Hegel says, the presentation of this progression of the logical categories would demand that at no stage of the development should any thought determination or reflection occur that does not directly emerge at that specific stage and does not proceed in it from the preceding determinations. A demand which is also to be found after a fashion in the process of mathematical inference. But I must admit that such an abstract perfection of presentation must generally be renounced. The very fact that the logic must begin with the purely simple and therefore the most general and empty restricts it to expressions of the simple that are themselves absolutely simple without the further addition of a single word. Only allowed, as the matter at hand requires, would be negative reflections intended to ward off and keep at bay whatever the imagination or an undisciplined thinking might otherwise adventitiously bring in. However, such intrusive elements in the otherwise simple immanent course of the development are essentially accidental, and the effort to ward them off would therefore be itself tainted with accidentality. And as he sort of says, basically, it's not the sort of reflections on the progression are not really needed for the logical progression itself, but we still kind of he still basically makes them in the course of the logic. And I think if we accept something like this characterization of Hegel's method and the logic as definitive, then we would have to distinguish between sort of several layers of Hegel's text in the science of logic. So one layer would be the actual progression of logical categories, this kind of immanent without bringing in anything extrinsic or anything that comes out later. And the second layer, or maybe more than one, is his own commentary about it, right? Where he does sometimes anticipate something that comes out not only later or something that came up before, or he sometimes contrasts it with the views of other authors on similar issues. Okay. So yeah, why am I talking about all of this? Well, I think Karen sometimes seems to interpret what is going on in the logic before the section on the idea by reference to Hegel's concept of life in the kind of way that seems to conflict with this sort of Hegel's characterizations of the way he goes on in the logic. So for example, in chapter 5, Karen says that, and I quote on page 184, the form of activity of Naturzwecke thus sets the standard against which objectivity is measured. Insofar as the judgment of syllogism, qua activity of the subjective concept, is more or less able to express the relation between the universal and the individual displayed in organic form, and thereby actually determine something as individual, that judgment of syllogism is more or less objective, more or less able to convey the truth of its subject matter. So she seems to say that, yeah, we have Hegel sort of presupposes as standard the category of life, which only comes up much later in the logic, and that standard drives his progression within the section, subjectivity section of the subjective logic. And somewhat similarly, Karen's reading of the absolute relations chapter from the Wesens logic seems to be largely oriented towards showing inadequacies of various relations discussed there in comparison with those exhibited in the logical concept of life. At least that's how I read like some things that she says there. However, even though Hegel himself, for example, compares the relation of causality with that of life, so there's this remark where he says that the relation of causality is not applicable to relations of life, whether natural or spiritual. That sort of remark seems to belong exactly to this commentary on his logical progression, on logical development, and not to the main line of thought in the logic. And yeah, that I think is even in the text itself. Hegel says something like "es ist zu bemerken," and so it seems to indicate that it's just a remark and not part of the argument. So yeah, that was my second worry, and I just wonder what Karen thinks about these issues of the methodology of how to read Hegel's logic. And I realize that it's really difficult to interpret Hegel's logic throughout in this kind of forward-looking way. But yeah, I just wonder what she thinks about it.
Thank you so much, Anton. This is a very difficult question, and I think one of the things that I probably don't do enough in the book is talk about sort of at the meta level of what's going on in Hegel's logic and how we are to understand the progression of the categories. I'd like your distinction between the forward-looking and the backward-looking. I think that's very helpful. Another way that it's been put to me, the way your question is whether Hegel himself, in the forward-looking or the sort of strictly immanent way in which these categories are supposed to develop, a question it's been put to me, does Hegel cheat? Is it that Hegel himself might be cheating in these various places? I think your point about the remarks is also really important. It's clear that as the logic progresses, especially in the objective logic, the use of remarks is really important for Hegel, precisely because I think, the content of the thought determinations themselves are somehow it's not yet concrete enough to sort of stand on their own. And so he feels the need to offer a lot of remarks to explain what's going on, but as by the time we get to the subjective logic, and especially the closer we get to the end, the remarks drop out, and I take that to be sort of Hegel thinking that the content of the thought determinations has become concrete enough that he no longer needs to sort of give this running commentary alongside it. So I like this distinction between forward-looking and backward-looking. So yeah, one way of putting your question is, am I cheating in reading into some of these earlier thought determinations, things that come later? I would want to, in the case of in chapter 5, so in the reading of the progression from concept, judgment, and syllogism, and this passage that you quote where I say that I do think that the unity of a Naturswerk, or the unity of a natural purpose somehow sets the standard for thinking about how Hegel thinks about judgment. I think I don't think I was anticipating something that was going to come later, because I tried to argue that the way that really what sets the standard there is the concept. So because I argued that the very structure or the way that Hegel presents the concept is already modeled on the idea of the natural purpose. So I don't think either my reading or even Hegel himself, I don't think he's just smuggling in ideas that are going to come later, because I think he's already, by the time we get into the subjective logic, I think he's already established that the unity of the concept, or the way that he presents the unity of the concept in terms of this relationship between universal, individual, in particular, draws on the way that Kant thinks about the unity of the natural purpose. So once we're in the subjective logic, I think I would want to argue that I wasn't just anticipating the concept of life that was going to come later, but in a way that this is already set up. In the section on actuality, I think this is more complicated, and maybe here, like Hegel, who feels the need to draw more on remarks in the objective logic, I think I too, in my account, in order to make sense of what was going on, I needed to almost project the goal I needed to really emphasize I needed to keep the goal in view, right? The goal in view being the genesis of the concept requires that we are trying to give an account of something like this internal this idea of reciprocity that is very similar to the way that Kant talks about a natural purpose being the cause and effect of itself. I think I might have anticipated as you said, that if we want to call it cheating, but it's very difficult to make sense. Like I said in my introductory, maybe I'm glad that I admitted that now, that chapter is still the most puzzling to me and most difficult to make sense of. It was just very difficult for me to make sense of the way, from a forward-looking perspective, how the argument in actuality actually runs without keeping in view the goal of articulating that notion of reciprocity. So I take that point, and I think the distinction between forward-looking and backward-looking is helpful. Going back to your first question about the antinomy and then the intuitive understanding. So I don't want to overstate, in arguing for the propositiveness theme, I want to say that the concept of internal purposiveness is the there's so many ways to tell the Kant, from Kant to Hegel story, and different interpreters have focused on different concepts in Kant, the concept of apperception, the concept of the intuitive understanding, and I wanted to make the case that purposiveness was the most productive or fruitful way to tell the story from Kant to Hegel story. I don't say that the intuitive understanding isn't important, so I don't want to I don't want to say that it's not important. The argument, and you're absolutely right, you say that, well, ultimately Hegel is saying that we have the powers of the intuitive understanding. I think there's a sense in which that has to be right. The way that I try to make the argument in the book is that Hegel, in attributing the powers of the so-called intuitive understanding to us, what Hegel is really saying is that why do we have the power to intuit the synthetic universal, the whole as a whole, as Kant says? It's not because we have the powers of the intuitive understanding. It's because we ourselves, we exhibit this organic synthetic unity. So even if it's the case that, sure, there is certainly a sense in which Hegel and a lot of the other and other German idealists want to, say, yes, we do have the powers of the intuitive understanding, but the way that Hegel understands that is that, well, we have that power because we ourselves are living beings. That living minds, living minds have the capacity to intuit or perceive or grasp organic wholes and organic unity because we ourselves are this unity. Then it seems to me that hanging on to the language of the intuitive understanding, we're moving so far from what Kant thought the intuitive understanding, we're almost going in the complete opposite direction, right? The intuitive understanding is supposed to be a kind of creative godlike mind. As you said, it's a limit concept for Kant. It's the contrast to a discursive understanding. Whereas in attributing these powers to us, Hegel's interest is in thinking about ourselves as living minds. That seems to go in the complete opposite direction of the idea of an intuitive understanding. And so that's the justification that I give for saying, it's not that I think it's unimportant, but that's the way that I try to defend going the way in taking proposiveness as primary rather than taking the intuitive understanding as primary.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Then I'd like to introduce our final respondent, Ben Berger. He's a visiting assistant professor at Haverford College, and he specializes in 19th century idealism and, like Anton, in Schelling's and Hegel's philosophy of nature. His publications include a forthcoming monograph titled Schelling, Hegel, and Logic of Emergence from Nature to Spirit. Yes, so I hope that your book is going to be quite different from Karen's. Yes, that they're not exactly making the same type of claims.
I hope it's
please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Karen, and thank you and Henny and to all the other organizers for putting this event together and for inviting me to say some things about Karen Ng's book. Like many of us, I'm still getting used to this sort of thing in the COVID era, but I think this Zoom seminar on classical German philosophy is very exciting, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. I only have 10 minutes, so it won't be possible for me to come even close to mentioning all of the excellent things about Ng's book. But before I begin, I just want to encourage everyone who hasn't already done so to read Hegel's Concept of Life. It really is an excellent book, one that puts forward many novel and convincing arguments about Hegel's logic and about the doctrine of the concept in particular. So while I don't have time to discuss all the merits of Ng's book right now, I want to simply state up front what an exciting contribution to Hegel scholarship the book is. The questions I'd like to raise today have to do, broadly speaking, with the implications of Ng's interpretation of the doubling of the idea at the end of the logic. This interpretation of the doubling of the idea is very much the culmination of the book's argument. After tracing Hegel's understanding of internal purposiveness and its role in cognition to his early engagement with Kant, Fichte, Hölderlin, and Schelling, the book goes on to explicate the logical development of the concept, as we've been discussing, as that development is presented in the third part of the logic, a development that ends with the concept determining itself as the idea in two ways, as life and as cognition. And the story Ng tells here is, to my mind, largely convincing. More importantly still, it illuminates a great deal of what is, by all accounts, one of the most challenging parts of Hegel's system. Ng's interpretation of the doubling of the idea also raises a number of questions. Questions about the ground or grounds of cognition, questions about the relationship between the science of logic and the other parts of the system, and questions about how far we ought to go in embracing a Kantian reading of Hegel. These topics are all closely related, but I'll do my best to work through them one by one and as quickly as possible. So chapter 7, Ng describes how self-determining reason, or the idea, necessarily divides and rejoins itself as subjective activity on the one hand and objective being on the other. Significantly, the idea does this in two distinct ways. In its most basic self-diremption and reunification, the idea manifests itself as life, that is, subject-object identity in an, quote, immediate and unconscious form. Insofar as the idea or reason is more fully actualized, it manifests itself as self-conscious cognition. The first thing that's worth noting about this is that it leads Ing to argue that life grounds cognition. For it is only insofar as the idea expresses itself immediately and unconsciously in life that it can subsequently express itself in self-consciousness. In addition to identifying life as the ground of cognition, Ing also claims that, quote, life is a necessary condition for self-conscious cognition, and that, quote, life is necessary insofar as it is a presupposition of cognition. As I see it, Ing's understanding of life as a ground, a condition, a presupposition of self-conscious cognition is a strength of her argument. Although it should be noted that thinking in terms of grounds and conditions is not something Hegel would want us to be doing here in the doctrine of the concept, given the fact that these are closer to the kind of logical forms we find in the doctrine of essence. Ing herself suggests something along these lines when she helpfully states that, quote, life is not the cause of spirit, but its first actuality. In other words, Hegel doesn't think that life is one kind of being that causes or grounds the existence of an entirely other kind of being. Rather, life is the more basic manifestation of reason, and in this way, life makes a more fully realized form of reason, that is, cognition, possible. So setting aside Hegel's own skepticism regarding the language of grounding, I think Ing is entirely convincing that for Hegel, life is some kind of condition or ground of self-consciousness. But if we're going to consider those things that ground self-consciousness, why stop at life? Don't all of the logical determinations that precede cognition in the logic ground cognition in some sense? Is life really the only determination required for cognition to be? Ing addresses this question implicitly when she argues that life is unlike the other determinations in the logic insofar as life is more true, or that it actualizes the truth of reason more fully. And to be sure, life, understood in terms of internal purposiveness, does more fully express the truth of reason than mechanism, chemism, or external teleology do. So these are the logical determinations that immediately precede the logic of life. And yet, the same can be said of self-conscious cognition. Cognition is more fully expressive of the idea or self-determining reason than life is. But this doesn't prevent Ing from arguing, rightly in my view, that life, the less true, grounds cognition, the more true. Indeed, as Ing demonstrates, self-conscious cognition depends in some sense upon life. Why then not make the same argument for those logical determinations that are not organic? Why not claim that just as cognition depends upon life, so too both cognition and life depend upon logical forms that are at work in the inorganic world? So my first question for Ing is really, what's the significance of the fact that life and cognition are only possible, according to Hegel, on the basis of inorganic processes? Now, one might think that this question is misguided. Ing states unequivocally that she is not in the business of defending Hegel's philosophy of nature in this book. And the simple fact is that Hegel's logic is not about nature. And this means that whatever claims Hegel makes in the logic regarding the ontological conditions or presuppositions of cognition, these will not be, at this stage in the system, natural conditions or natural presuppositions. Indeed, even when Hegel is describing the idea's manifestation as life, he is not saying anything concrete about natural life, or he's not supposed to be saying anything concrete about natural life. And so from that perspective, it may seem fair that Ing leaves out a consideration of the way the inorganic natural world grounds not only self-conscious cognition, but also life itself. The problem, however, and this isn't just a problem for Ing's interpretation of Hegel, it seems to me this is a problem for every interpretation of Hegel. It's a problem with how Hegel goes about writing the logic. The problem is that while Hegel seeks to unfold a logic of life that doesn't get entangled with the more concrete logic of the material world, the details of the logic of life do just this. Ing works through these details in chapter 7, and I don't have time to get into those details here, but it should suffice to say that central to Hegel's account of life in the logic is a discussion of the way life necessarily involves a kind of corporeal individuality, a discussion of the way an organism is motivated by hunger and the drive to reproduce, a discussion of the way such an organism, on the basis of these urges, must go outside of itself in search of objects that might satisfy its urges, thus engaging with the world external to its corporeal self. In other words, a key part of Hegel's account of life in the Logic is the way a living individual is out there in the world, a world characterized by externality. My own view is that at the end of the Logic, when Hegel's discussing corporeality, externality, and so on, he's beginning to describe the concrete logic of natural life and animal life in particular, because he has done this rather before properly transitioning to the philosophy of nature. In other words, these are passages in which Hegel gets ahead of himself, something that I take it as a habit of Hegel's. So the second main question I want to raise is simply, although Hegel says he's not talking about natural life in the Logic, isn't he really? And isn't Ing also talking about natural life when she champions Hegel's account of the relationship between life and cognition? My hunch is that Ing doesn't see Hegel as getting ahead of himself in this way, that I see him getting ahead of himself, because she reads him as carrying on and transforming Kant's transcendental project. So to conclude, I'll very quickly say something about that. I began a few moments ago by noting the novelty and sophistication of Ing's interpretation of the doubling of the idea at the end of the Logic. So the idea, again, manifests itself as life on the one hand, cognition on the other. Central to Ing's account of this double manifestation is that Hegel is replacing the two sources of knowledge in Kant's system, sensibility and the understanding, with a more complex pair, life and cognition. Without the moments that unfold in the logic of life, that is, without corporeality, externality, and the reproduction of the species, cognition, Ing claims, would be empty in the same way that for Kant, thoughts without content are empty. So there are many, many interesting things about the way Ing ties the doubling of the idea in Hegel to Kant's suggestion that there may be a common root of sensibility and the understanding. But I'd like to just point out the following. The view Ing presents as Hegel's view is ultimately that all knowledge is grounded in subjectivity. To be sure, Ing's Hegel insists upon the necessity of life as the basis of cognitive subjectivity, and in this way there is more than a hint of naturalized idealism here. Nevertheless, this naturalized idealism remains, it seems to me, committed to the Kantian transcendental orientation in philosophy, insofar as the subject, now the living subject, conditions the possibility of objective knowledge. To see this transcendental orientation in action, we might consider how Ing refers to the difference between the living and the non-living. She writes, quote, "The difference between being as life and being as non-life is categorical and irreducible from the point of view of things that live," end quote. From the point of view of things that live. On Ing's reading of Hegel, our understanding of things, including our understanding of the difference between the living and the non-living, and therefore our understanding of that which grounds our own cognition, all of that is based in our point of view as subjects, subjects that don't only think, but also live. As I see it, Hegel's idealism seeks to overcome this subjectivist orientation in philosophy and to understand the basis of cognition, not only insofar as it appears to living things like us, but also the way this basis of cognition in fact is. And it just so happens, cognition is not only based in a living subject, but in inorganic processes that are more fundamental than any form of life, natural or spiritual. It also shouldn't be a problem for Hegel that he has to go beyond the logic in order to derive the grounds of living, thinking subjectivity, since the purpose of the logic is not to provide a complete account of what makes thought as something actually lived possible. On the contrary, it is only in the philosophies of nature and spirit that the necessary existence of thought as something lived is to be demonstrated.
Maybe you can conclude here, Ben?
Yeah, okay, I'm done. Sorry, Karen. Ing's reading of Hegel is the most compelling Kantian reading I've encountered, yet despite her book's emphasis on the way life makes thought possible, it nevertheless leaves us with a surprisingly non-metaphysical Hegel, or at the very least, a Hegel for whom metaphysics begins with the subject in both method and content. And I'd be interested in knowing whether Karen thinks this is fair of me to attribute something like a non-metaphysical interpretation of Hegel's concept of life to her. Okay, sorry for going over.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I purposely avoided in different drafts of the introduction. I've thought about framing things in terms of metaphysical and non-metaphysical, and then I ultimately decided to move away from that way of framing things. I don't know that can fully do justice to that question. I guess maybe the short answer is, well, I surely think that thinking about teleology and life and internal purposiveness, those are highly metaphysical kinds of questions. So I guess, but maybe I think your point about a Kantian, I think that last question of yours, that ultimately you think that the Hegel that I presented is quite Kantian. I think that's maybe a question that I can try to address. I think so. It is a Kantian Hegel. I mean, I start with Kant's third critique, and I argue that it is really out of this concept of internal purposiveness that Hegel builds his philosophical system. So of course, there's a sense in which it is a Kantian Hegel. One thing I want to maybe shift the way that, so you said that the idealism that I presented, it's sort of that knowledge is based in subjectivity, and this emphasis on the idea of a subjective point of view. I think, so I don't want to deny that, but I think there's a way in which Hegel tries to rethink the way that knowledge is opened. So the way that I put it is that life opens up the possibility of intelligibility. There's certainly a way in which we can think of that as merely subjective in a pejorative sense. But I think rather than thinking of Hegel as just being Kantian here, I think we can think one of the amazing things that Hegel and German idealism, I think, it's a sort of methodological point about the way that they present their ideas, is that it's not about emphasizing a subjective point of view. I don't think that this is the case even for Ficta, in emphasizing, in trying to ground knowledge in the absolute activity of the I. I don't think that the point is to try to say, okay, all knowledge is grounded in the subject in some sort of obviously problematic sense. But it's a point about the reflexivity involved in trying to give an account that anything that we try to give an account of, we also have to be able to give an account of how we can give an account of that. I don't know if that's a very convoluted way of putting it. And so in saying that life opens up the possibility of intelligibility, he's not saying that, oh, therefore intelligibility is always somehow restricted, right? That's the Kantian move that I think he would resist. It's not that he's trying to say that that means that intelligibility is always going to be restricted to some particular point of view. Pippin has called this a parochial way of thinking about intelligibility, that renders, the way that renders intelligibility somehow parochial. I don't think that that's Hegel's claim. It's really about, we might say, we don't want to stop there. We always have to sort of take that other dialectical turn. So intelligibility is opened up by living activity and living processes. I think in order for being to be rendered intelligible, there has to be, right, something for which being is intelligible. And I think that's why the concept of life is so important for Hegel. I think he wants to insist that this doesn't make it a merely subjective point of view. Even that language of the subject object, right? The way that in that early work, he thinks it's something about that subjective point of view is also an object. It's not just that it's also objective, it's also an object in the world. So I guess I would just want to, going back to, the way that I think about method as this dialectic between life and cognition, I would just want to sort of continue. I would want to keep that thought moving. So I wouldn't want to stop at, okay, therefore knowledge is merely subjective. I think Hegel wants to continually to sort of take the next dialectical turn, rather than saying that simply because life opens up the possibility of intelligibility, that means that our knowledge is somehow restricted in some way. I think that's the Kantian move he would want to resist. But there's so much more to say about this. Maybe very quickly, so why not, just going backwards, why not why isn't cognition grounded in all of the preceding thought determinations? And actually your suggestion, which I actually kind of like, that actually ultimately it's not just cognition is not just grounded in life, but actually these non-living, non-organic processes. You're right to claim that there we're sort of entering into the domain of the philosophy of nature. I'm actually sympathetic that I think by the time that we get to the idea, he is beginning, instead of seeing him as sort of smuggling things in from the philosophy of nature, I think the concreteness of the idea, right? So if the idea is the unity of concept and objectivity, in a way, concept and reality, in a way, I think the idea, one way to read it, not as cheating, so to speak, is that in the idea, he's already beginning to make the transition into the discussion of these more concrete topics of the real philosophy, like nature. Just to give another example, he begins to talk about space and time in that section. And again, that sounds like that's not a category of the logic. Clearly, that's a category of the philosophy of nature. So I think that in the idea, he's beginning to make that transition. And so the openness to some more, concrete stuff, so to speak, I think is maybe we can read that as deliberate. Why the emphasis on grounding in life? And then your point about ground is also well taken. Again, we work on these things for so long. In earlier drafts, there was a long section about ground and why trying to justify my use of the concept of ground, given that ground is a concept from the doctrine of essence, is a thought determination from the doctrine of essence. And so technically speaking, we've moved beyond the logic of grounding. One thing, maybe I'll just say one thing there. Hegel does already say there in the doctrine of essence that the proper relationship of ground, that the proper way to think about grounds has to do with thinking about ends, that it's really a teleological concept of ground. And so there, I think that when I talk about cognition being grounded in life, I would sort of take up that notion of ground that he sort of already anticipates already in the doctrine of essence. And in terms of why I don't want to talk about cognition as being grounded in non-organic processes. You emphasize the difference, the distinction. I think we could say that Hegel certainly thinks that non-organic processes are something like the cause of cognition. I don't know if I would say that they are the ground of cognition in the specific sense that I mean, in part because one thing that I emphasize, why is life the appropriate ground? Because life has the same form as cognition, right? That there's something about the structural, the form of the activity of life that is identical with the form and activity of cognition. And so the way that Hegel thinks about actualization, or as you mentioned, this idea of first actuality, cognition cannot be grounded in something that doesn't essentially share the same form as itself. And so that's why life is the appropriate ground and not non-organic processes. That, of course, doesn't mean that he's, at one point, I even say that he's a bit of a materialist here. He definitely thinks that mind is made, there's no sort of dualistic metaphysics where mind is, made up of different stuff than mechanical and chemical processes. I think Hegel definitely thinks that mind is made up of mechanical and chemical processes. But if we're thinking about grounding in that sort of deeper sense, I think for Hegel, life can't be grounded in something that doesn't share its same, cognition can't be grounded in something that doesn't share the same form. And only living processes and activities are going to share the same form as mind. And so that's why I say that life is cognition is grounded in life, but not in these non-organic processes that nonetheless surely play an essential role in how mind works.
Okay,
sorry,
Karen,
that's all really quick.
Sorry to interrupt, but so I know there's more to say to this, but in a way, I would like to move to the Q&A if you don't mind.
Yes, definitely.
With you and with
Yes.
Ben? Yes, so the floor is open. Yes, Tyler, please.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much for talking about your book. I really appreciate it. I just had a quick follow-up actually about some of the things that you were just talking about. It seems like Hegel's account of life, he really wants to do at least two different things. That is to offer a conceptual determination of life as a limitation and enabling condition for the intelligibility of cognition. And I think that this is the dimension in the science of logic that you've been discussing a lot. And then, as the last questioner just mentioned, there's also a dimension of life in Hegel's account where it's a natural phenomena, that has to be explained as well. And so I guess I was wondering how you think Hegel balances the competing desideratums between life sort of as a conceptual determination, making possible our knowledge, but also as a natural phenomena that we can describe instances of. And then relatedly, whether Hegel's modified conception of life at the logical level implies differences, at the level of philosophy of nature. And, obviously Schelling and Goethe tried to develop naturalistic projects around a notion of internal propositiveness. Do you think that Hegel's account in the logic sort of provides a basis for understanding living things in a biological sense, or should we take Hegel's conceptual analysis of life to be solely concerned with the sort of metaphysical questions, that he's generally concerned with in his philosophical system? Or does it actually affect our natural scientific practice of understanding life? And if so, in what way? Thanks.
Thank you for that. Both of those are really good and difficult questions. So I like the way that you've put that we could see the concept of life as serving these two functions. So I think in the book, I'm primarily, as Ben also noted in his commentary, I did try to be careful to separate out the philosophy of nature. That was just in part, you can't, it's just too much to try to talk about all of the different ways in which Hegel uses the concept. So I definitely was focused on trying to understand the concept of life in the context of the logic. Maybe another way in which, so the logical concept of life, and here I think, again, Ben was right to point out this Kantian way of putting it. What makes the logic, even though Hegel is talking about all of this stuff that sounds very concrete, very natural, he's talking about bodies, he's talking about pain, he's talking about hunger. How is this, again, the question sort of keeps coming back, how is this not just, why isn't this just talking about natural life already? Why aren't we talking about a biological concept of life rather than the logical concept? I think rather than thinking about the content, because I think it's clearly the case that the content pretty much mirrors a lot of what Hegel is going to say in the philosophy of nature about organics. There's just no doubt about that. But I think what I try to focus on the conceptual side is the function that the concept of life serves within the context of the argument of the logic. And there, I think Hegel is suggesting that it in saying that cognition presupposes life, he's suggesting that we cannot, it is Kantian in the sense of thinking about the necessary conditions of possibility for being able to talk to conceive of or talk about or determine cognition at all. That the way in which we think about, I'll just take the example of the body, because that seems to be a clear example where he seems to be talking about something so concrete. Why is that not just sort of leaving the strictures of the logic and going into the philosophy of nature? The role of the body there is not to talk about how specific bodies might give us specific capacities for thinking. It's the claim that cognition, right? It's a necessary condition for thinking about the possibility of cognition, that it has to be realized in some body. So that's what makes it an a priori or conceptual claim. Obviously, once we get into details about bodies, that's going to be, then we're going to be talking about natural life or biological life. But thinking about corporeality as an a priori or necessary condition for being able to conceive of cognition at all, I think that's the way that the argument's going to work in the logic. And that's what makes the account of life, even when he's talking about bodies and all kinds of other very concrete things, still sticking at the level of logic. Another thing that I try to draw out, going back to this comparison with Kant, and Ben drew out that I tried to suggest that life and cognition sort of, it replaces the way that Kant thinks about sensibility and understanding. Another way that I try to insist on the a priority, I guess, of the discussion of life in the logic is that when Hegel is talking about corporeality and externality, that's another way in which he's going to replace the way that Kant thinks about inner sense and outer sense. So even there, right, that's clearly a priori. We're talking about bodies and we're talking about a relationship to the environment. But again, the function that it serves is that, okay, this is a necessary presupposition of cognition because this is how Hegel is going to think about inner and outer sense. So that's, I hope that helps in terms of trying to sort out the messiness. I don't want to claim that there's no messiness there. I'm also, again, I'm sympathetic to the way Ben said that, I think Hegel just gets messy and we can try to sort it out. I think it's important to try to sort it out, but I wouldn't want to, clean it up so much to say that, Hegel doesn't at all, or that Hegel, or maybe going back to the backwards and forward-looking reading, that Hegel sort of sticks with only a forward-looking approach and doesn't ever smuggle in other ideas. In terms of, do I think does Hegel's concept of life also help us think about natural phenomena and a biological concept of life? Very quickly, I want to say the answer is yes, but that's not something that I take up in the book. And it's something that I've definitely thought a lot about since writing the book. But yeah, the short answer is yes, I hope so.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is from Andrea.
You hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, well, first, congratulations on the book. I really like reading it, and I think it's a very timely book. Not only for Hegel studies, because it's starting, as you were saying at the beginning, there's more and more people that are starting to question the concept of life, which up until a few years back was, especially in the US, was anything nature related was really bad and not worth looking into. But it's also timely because for debates that are going on outside Hegel studies, and especially in philosophy of biology, there is a big wave on insisting on the fact that organisms are agents and we need to regain an agential perspective, etc. And in a way, what I'm trying to do right now is trying to make the connection between those two debates. And thus, reading your book was very exciting in a way. So the question I want to ask is about something that is not really in the book, or it is in the book only implicitly. Because reading the book from this perspective, I was waiting for something to come, and that something came at page 104 when you finally mentioned in a note even Thompson and all those debates that are since Francisco Varela, and I have this idea that Francisco Varela and Hegel have a very, very similar account of intrinsic purposiveness and the relation between mind and cognition, and thus all the autopoietic and activism is one way or another very Hegelian, whether they know it or not. And so you mentioned it in the note, and then you move on. So I was wondering that's not necessarily your job, so it's not a fault on your part. But I was wondering whether you have a position or ideas, or whether that kind of debates play a role in your specific reading of Hegel, or whether you think Hegel has something to say to those debates.
Thank you for that. Again, I'm talking so much about the sort of process, the writing process. I think, again, in earlier versions, I thought that Evan Thompson, his work was so important for me when I was beginning to write, and I thought it would play a bigger role. But the way that writing works is that you realize you can't do everything. Maybe going back to the last question that I just answered, I think the way that Evan Thompson and other enactivists think about the continuity between life and mind. I think the very idea of autopoiesis is basically very much connected to the concept of internal proposiveness. In fact, I think of them as, I don't want to say they're identical, they're probably not identical, but they certainly share a lot of affinities. The idea of autopoiesis shares a lot of affinities, not just with the notion of internal proposiveness, but the way that Kant talks about self-organization. And so I think I just completely agree with you. But going back to the last question, the reason that this didn't play a bigger role was because of the sort of systematic importance in Hegel of separating out, I guess, questions of philosophy, not just philosophy of biology, but I think also philosophy of mind, because of course Hegel also himself has a philosophy of mind that he discusses in a different part of the system. But I wanted to be more clear, I guess, about separating out these issues pertaining to, I'll just stick with the term philosophy of mind, and what comes up and the discussion that is relevant for the logic. And so that's why ultimately the very interesting and I think important debates in activism. I'm also really enjoying the new work by Peter Godfrey Smith that also basically tries to argue I think it's very, of course, I don't think any of these people think of it as Hegelian, but I think of it as very Hegelian, the way in which a lot of, philosophers of biology and philosophers of mind are basically thinking along these terms, that in order to understand cognition, we first need to understand processes of life as you said, bringing back concepts of teleology used appropriately, bringing back language of intentionality and agency in terms of thinking about life. I think all of that just sounds right. It's all very exciting to me. I'd love to hear more about your work, because I would also like in future work to think more about Hegel's possible contribution to questions and problems in philosophy of biology. But you're right, in terms of the context of the book, the reason why that ended up being a footnote rather than something more substantial was just because I needed to keep, I wanted to at least try to make the case for a distinctively logical concept of life and the role that plays in Hegel's logic without muddying the waters too much by bringing in, how this might work when we're thinking about philosophy of biology or the philosophy of mind.
Thanks. Oh, I might have a follow-up, but if there's just someone else,
Well, maybe in view of the time, maybe you can discuss later on. Are there other questions? Louis, maybe? I think you had Louis, yes?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you so much, Karin, for the presentation of the book. It sounds really excellent, and discussion was excellent. I just have a question, because I must confess that I am a little bit puzzled with this concept of life in a logical level and concept of life in this natural level. And how do we understand the relation between both? Because you said that it is not a subjective reading of Hegel because the process of life opens the possibility of intelligibility. But this process of life is a process of life in a natural sense, or is a process of life in a logical sense? If it is a process of life in a logical sense, then we go back to logic. And then what is that is opening up the possibility of intelligibility? Is it life as a biological process, or is it life as a logical process? And when when is it life as a logical process? So how can we understand and make the distinction between those two conceptions of life? So I was just a little bit puzzled about the priority. Is the priority the process of life as a biological process, or the process of life as a logical process? If it is the logical process, then do we go back to subjectivism? So yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks. So it sounds like now this is another version of this, maybe the most difficult question. So I would say I'd like to be able to say both, and then hope, so both in the sense that biological life does, for Hegel, open up the possibility, the actuality of intelligibility, insofar as, so in that more naturalistic or biological or material sense. But what I've been trying to say is that that's not, I think the argument in the idea maybe sort of straddles the, I didn't say this in the book, but now I'm beginning to think that maybe, you know, by the time we get to the idea, we could say that Hegel is slowly emerging from, you know, the realm of shadows in which he's speaking in the domain of the logic, and you know, slowly stepping out into reality, and the real philosophy. So the idea then is going to, the argument of the idea is going to try to straddle, and you know, I'm not sure how successfully at the end of the day he does this. The argument that is going to be strictly logical and a priori, so that argument, that the claim that we cannot, it is to be able to conceive of cognition, it's a necessary presupposition for cognition, an a priori condition for the possibility of cognition, that we understand that we have this concept of life processes, in the sense that he lays out in the chapter on life. And then on the other hand, there is also going to be this claim that, yeah, at the material or natural level, minds are something that emerge out of, minds are always living. So that's going to be, you could say, maybe using the forward and backward looking in a different sense now. Forward looking in the sense that looking forward into the philosophy of nature, and in looking forward into the system of the real philosophy, where we're going to talk about the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of mind. It's certainly the case that I think Hegel thinks that minds are something that emerge. Minds are something that emerge out of living processes, and maybe arguably even, I'm really looking forward to your book, Benjamin. You're right, not just living processes, but also inorganic processes. We need to be able to track that entire process of development, especially if we don't want to end up with the concept of mind that is dualistic, that is somehow separate from mechanical, chemical, and organic processes. And then sort of looking back into the logic, it seems that there, I think, maybe if I were now to rewrite that section, I would have to actually say that something about the section on the idea might be running two parallel kinds of arguments, that there is that logical side of the argument where, yes, life is a presupposition of cognition. There's also this puzzling claim that I make a lot of in the book, where Hegel goes back to this language of emptiness, that cognition would be empty without thinking about the determination of life. And that's a very puzzling formulation, because that sounds very Kantian. That sounds too Kantian, in fact, because of course, the insistence from the beginning of the logic is that, no, it's a mistake to think of logic. It's a mistake to think of these forms as empty. They have their own intrinsic content. And so it's very puzzling that Hegel would come back to this idea that there's something, that this emptiness, that cognition and the logical thought determinations are empty without thinking about life. I think the way to make sense of that is, again, the idea is trying to exit the realm of shadows. Once we get to the section on the idea, we're trying to now think about how the thought determinations are going to be actualized in the domains of real philosophy. And so I think yeah, if I were to maybe restate it, I would want to emphasize the way in which the argument of the idea has to do this delicate balancing act of making the claim on the logical side, and then also anticipating and maybe already beginning to make the argument on the side of the philosophy of nature.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so we have two more questions. Sorry, I'd like to ask those who are going to ask their question to keep it really short. Farhad, please.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I hope to read your book very soon. Just to be brief, what do you think is the concept of intuitive understanding in Hegel? I ask this as a follow-up to your discussion about inorganic and organic processes, how cognition or life can be based on inorganic processes, because I think this is exactly the role it plays in Kant. I feel that when Kant invokes the notion of intuitive understanding, he is somehow referring to the Leibnizian view of life as an infinite machine, you know, the Cartesian notion of living being as a machine, and then Leibniz adds that every part of that machine is itself a living being and it goes ad infinitum. And there is an infinite analysis, so to speak. And it sounds that if we just neglect this transition from inorganic to organic processes, then there would be no invoking of the intuitive understanding. So does it really play any role in Hegel, or if any, or what? Thank you.
So I'm not sure what you mean by, so I've never thought about the connection between the intuitive understanding and this transition, as you say, from inorganic to organic processes. The way that I think, so I think going back to Anton's question, I think traditionally it's been sort of and the text sort of supports this. So Hegel has lots of positive things to say about the idea of the intuitive understanding. So I think the textual basis for this interpretation is there. And it's consistent. So he never stops praising the importance of the intuitive understanding. I think in terms of the role that I think it plays in Hegel, I think for me, the most helpful work on this is Eckhart Förster's work, sort of trying to separate out this idea of intellectual intuition from intuitive understanding. That's been the most helpful account that I've read on this. And so maybe I'll just repeat a little bit what I said in response to Anton. I think it plays a role. I think at the end of the day, yes, everything, Hegel basically wants to say that we have the powers of the intuitive understanding. We can intuit and perceive organic wholes. Clearly, this has to be a very important part of his philosophy. I think my line is just that the reason we have this capacity is because we're living beings. And so that seems to just swing in the complete opposite direction of the original account of the intuitive understanding, which was precisely put forward as a limit concept or a contrast concept to a discursive understanding. It's supposed to go all the way up to say something, it's a power of a divine mind. Hegel's saying, no, it's a power of a living mind. And so that's my justification for saying, at the end of the day, the concept of the intuitive understanding isn't that important for my interpretation.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. The final question is by Richard Eldridge.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to all the participants. I really enjoyed the session. I'm very sympathetic to the view that you're eliciting out of Hegel, Karen, in the philosophy of mind on its own terms. And the scholarship, as I understand it, I haven't yet read the book, strikes me as compelling. I will have to read it. But I want to ask about the move you make really at the very beginning and whether it's well motivated. So the move seemed to be that Hegel uncovers some kind of contradiction in the idea of a purposiveness of nature that's referred to or analogous to any kind of external agency or designer. And he substitutes for that a more thoroughly immanent or internal purposiveness. And the question is, does he consider and have an argument against the thought that once having uncovered that contradiction, we might drop the concept of proposiveness altogether or regard it as only heuristic? Is there something to show in Hegel's text or in general that we need a full concept of internal proposiveness as other than heuristic?
So the contradiction, I think, is already identified by Kant. That's something that I tried, so that to justify Hegel's reading, I want to say that the reading of Kant is warranted, because I think Kant himself thinks that there's something about thinking about that thinking about nature as designed is a contradiction in terms, because it's precisely to think of nature as artificial instead of natural. So that seems to be immediately a problem. And I think Hegel takes that up. What you say about the heuristic, the problem is, of course, that in a way that's Kant's path, right? Kant basically, so he struggles with it. He says it seems that in order to make sense of judgment and all of its capacities, we need this concept of proposiveness. I can't make sense of it. And the reason Kant can't make sense of it, given all kinds of, the apparatus that he's laid out in the first critique, I think that's ultimately one of the reasons why he can't make sense of it, except for as a heuristic. So that's going to be Kant's path. And in the book, I try to, long, complicated story, that Hegel's going to argue that no, the concept of proposiveness has to be constitutive and not simply regulative, or you use the term heuristic, not merely regulative, as Kant says. I think Hegel does have an argument for it. I think he makes the argument in a number of different contexts. One place is in the Phenomenology of Spirit, in that really famous account of the transition from life to self-consciousness in chapter 4. He wants to make the claim that, going back to this recurring question of in what sense is life a logical concept? I think already in the Phenomenology, he's trying to give a kind of a priori account of life in the sense that it is a necessary condition for the possibility of thinking about self-consciousness. And so he's going to run the argument in a number of different places. But I think it's very important for Hegel that it's not a heuristic, that it's constitutive, that we cannot think, we cannot determine or think about cognition or self-consciousness without it, and that this is a kind of driving and recurring argument in a lot of the text. At least this is what I try to argue in the book.
If I could just, it looks to me like in chapter 4. Okay, go ahead.
In view of the time, maybe you can stay on and continue the discussion later on. But first of all, and before I'm going to thank all the speakers, I'd like to make a few remarks. So first of all, I'd like to remind you of the final session of this year's seminar, which is already next week on December 17. And we'll discuss a paper by Joël Klein on Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena. Yeah, so Joël is in the audience. I hope to see a number of you next week. And then I also wanted to mention that we will shortly advertise the program for the winter and spring of next year. And we will resume at January 21. So let me thank our speakers. Of course, first of all, Karen Eng for a wonderful introduction and discussion, and also Manja, Anton, and Ben for their contributions.